There's been a government announcement today that's going to make it more difficult for people to let out their homes for short periods. If you want to, you will have to get planning permission, you'll have to pay potentially £452 to get this permission, just to allow people to use your house for a few days if it's not your primary residence. There may be some exemption for your primary residence. But this is another regulation hitting people in the use of their own property. Why shouldn't you be allowed to let your property out to whomsoever you wish to let it out to freely? Why has the government got to interfere and create cost and regulation for people who aren't doing any harm? They're just allowing somebody else to live in their house. It doesn't change the fact that the house is being lived in by somebody. But this is symptomatic of a whole approach that has been wrong over several years and has pilloried the private landlord. Now, the private landlord is really important, both economically and in terms of housing provision. What does the private landlord do? He provides flexibility. So if you want a mobile labour force, you need the private landlord so that people can move, can go to where the jobs are, in Norman Tebbutt's famous phrase, that they will be able to move around the country to get employment. It provides flexibility because it can be short-term or long-term. And most private landlords are good and sensible people who, when they've got a good tenant, don't want to get rid of that tenant for frivolous reasons. They want that tenant to stay, providing an income. So it's good for both sides. And what has been happening recently has just stacked it against the private landlord, which will reduce supply and put up costs. So first of all, it's harder to offset interest liabilities against rent. What does that do? It pushes up rents, it makes letting properties more difficult and more expensive for the tenant. Likewise, getting rid of Section 21, this is one of these airy-fairy, lefty things that has the wrong consequence, the law of unintended consequence. What does it in fact do? It reduces supply. What happens if you reduce supply? Prices rise and you reduce flexibility. Landlords and tenants actually have an interest in flexibility in the market. Look how little private renting there was in the 1980s before it was freed up by Margaret Thatcher. If we take away things like Section 21, then there will be less supply, it will be harder for tenants. And I will declare an interest. I do have a property or two that I let out myself. But that's unimportant in the scheme of things. So the next one is just making this worse. The Airbnb issue makes it harder for people who own property. And what's the defence of this? Well, Michael Gove has said, and I quote, "I'm determined that we ensure that more people have access to local homes at affordable prices and that we prioritise families desperate to rent or buy a home of their own choice to where they work." That's great, but the way to do that's by building more homes. It's not by making it harder to rent. He also said, "Tourism brings many benefits to our economy, but in too many communities we have seen local people pushed out of cherished towns, cities and villages by huge numbers of short-term lets." Again, this is just the wrong way of looking at it. What we need is to build more houses. And if we build more houses, then the price of property will come down and we will reverse the decline in home ownership that we've seen in the last 20 years. We've fallen behind on building, partly because the population has grown because of mass migration, partly because household sizes have fallen, and partly because we've given in to short-sighted, narrow-minded NIMBYism. And that's what the government has done by failing to build more houses and blaming it all on the tenants. But I'm not convinced about DLUHC as a department. Can't even reply to letters. If anyone from DLUHC's listening, there's a letter outstanding from one of my constituents on the 19th of December, chased up on the 13th of February and on the 10th of March, from a landlord of student lents. They can't even be bothered to reply. So you do wonder, if they can't reply to their letters, do they really think through their policies?